Hello, friends. It's Aunt Nikki of Your Story Hour, and I'm excited to be here with you guys again. Now we're up to Chapter 4 in Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, and Still Mo by Sam Campbell. Let's see what's going on. Chapter 4, To Make a Long Tale Short. The paint spots which had been placed on the squints for identification purposes faded and disappeared rather soon. But they lasted long enough to let us learn the characteristics of each squirrel so that we could know one from the other. You do not identify animals just by some aspect or any more than you do people. It's the whole being of the creature that you recognize. You know the way he walks, moves, calls, and what he is most apt to do. You learn his likes and dislikes, his disposition, his habits. In fact, you know him so well you recognize him without knowing just how you do it. Before Duke's leave had ended, he knew Eeny, Meeny, Miny, Mo, and Still Mo so well he could identify them in the dark. At least he claimed he could. When we asked for proof, he resorted to paraphrasing an old gag. "Well," he said, "in the dark I put my finger in Eeny's mouth, and if Meeny bites me, it's Still Mo. On the other hand, if Meeny nestles up to my hand, it is Eeny, unless Still Mo doesn't do anything. Then I know it's Mo." We couldn't argue with that, for we wouldn't know where to begin. Duke kept a diary of the squints as long as he was there. He recorded how rapidly they grew and how their instincts and natural ways of living began to appear. The little fellows obviously knew they were squirrels and were right proud of the fact. With amazing ability, they climbed about the small trees and branches that had been placed in their cage. They gathered little bits of bark and leaves from the floor to make play nests of their own in select spots. To sharpen their teeth and strengthen their jaws, they chewed on twigs and branches. They chattered after the manner of their kind, sounding like a boy giving a vocal imitation of a machine gun. Within a week, they had taken themselves off their milk diet. It was infantile food and might be all right for youngsters, but they were now over a month old, and they would have no more of it. Instead, they chewed ferociously at peanuts and bread crusts, and took well to the buds, grasses, cabbage, and carrots we gave them. Immediately they began storing food, squirrel fashion, hiding it in corners and crotches and under leaves. Duke sat in the cage quietly for a long time one day, and then broke into a cackle spasm. Ginny and I went running to find out what the latest joke was. The chicories had kept Duke giggling much of the time. Now we found him, running his fingers through his long curly hair, searching for peanuts, laughing for a while. Still Mo, it seemed, had decided that would be a mighty fine place to store some food for the future. So while Duke had held perfectly still watching the operation, the saucy squirrel made trip after trip from his head to the pan of food and back, each time bringing a nut and concealing it among the curls. There's a picture. There's Still Mo sitting on Duke's head. "I held still," said Duke, "until the rascal began bringing breadcrumbs and pine cones, and then I decided he had gone far enough." He combed 9 peanuts out of his hair, while Still Mo crouched in a corner and chattered his disapproval. As with all animals, these 5 little fellows were strictly individual. Duke was a good observer, and his diary of the squints recorded traits that we could recognize as long as they remained under our observation. Eeny wore the green paint, was the gentle one, the natural pet, the lamb. She was the only female of the family, but certainly no weakling. In childish squabbles with her 4 brothers, she held her own, and they respected her. But she was always the approachable one. When Duke crawled into the cage, it was Eeny who first came to him. If the morning were cool, she might work her way into a pocket, lie contentedly in his big cupped hands, or nestled up to his neck. Red squirrels by nature are wary creatures and avoid intimate friendships with human beings. Eeny came close to breaking this rule. Even when the day came for the squints to burst out of their cage and take up life in the woods, this little one was hesitant. Continually she reached back to us and sometimes acted as if she wished we would learn to climb trees and live on a wood diet so we could be together more. Many of her little baby friendly habits with us were continued until she was a veteran forest squirrel. Eeny's expression was mild and affectionate. That is not always true of her kind. A red squirrel lives in a belligerent world and likes it. He banters and argues with all the creatures about him, asks no favors and gives none. Hence he looks saucy and is. But Eeny wore a somewhat kindly expression. Her sharp little eyes would look at us with lively interest written in them, but no hostility. Sometimes when Duke was stroking the little creature, though her back was hardly large enough to give one good rub, she would close her eyes in obvious contentment. Unquestionably, Eeny was Duke's favorite. "This is my pal," our captain would say as he reached down to pick up half a handful of the little creature. "She and I have lots of secrets. We know all the answers, don't we, old top?" And tiny little old top winked as if she agreed with all that had been said. Meeny was appropriately named. No girl-teasing, hair-pulling, spitball-shooting, teacher-baiting grammar school boy ever thought up more meanness than he. He wore the black paint, but not for long. He figured out how to scratch or rub it off with the wires of his cage. Surely he was a smart little scamp, along with his deviltry. He was the first one to argue out the various problems Duke continually gave the youngsters. He was the first to figure out the various problems Duke continually gave the youngsters. It was Meeny who first learned that Duke carried peanuts in various pockets, and he mastered the art of getting them. But he never misrepresented his motive. He went into those pockets for the sole purpose of obtaining food, and there was no pretense of making it a friendly gesture. Eeny would enter a pocket anyway, liked to stay there, and would welcome the hand that reached into her. Not so with Meeny. If there was no food, there was no reason to be there. Out he would come and tell Duke a few things in saucy squirrel talk. His disposition showed in every move. He was seldom still, even for a moment. Always he acted like a runner, towing the mark while he waited for the starter's gun. His tail frisked about and his head jerked, and he snapped out little chirps right and left as he stood always on attention. Duke had many a laugh about Meeny. "I know people like him," he said. "They live on edge as if the whole world were just waiting to take a bite at them, always trying to outsmart someone and hardly willing to come close enough to shake hands. They seem to have the notion that everyone is trying to do them out of something, and they want to do others first. They just bring trouble on themselves, for you can't trust a fellow who won't trust you." One day I heard Duke talking to Meeny in a most confidential way. It was futile, of course, for Meeny had not the slightest notion what all that wordy sound meant. But the converser was worth while, for Duke was clearing up his own thoughts. Maybe that is one of the greatest benefits of animal friends. They help us think things out. "Meeny," Duke was saying in tones patient and kindly, "you're just smart enough that you ought to be a little bit smarter." Meeny was perched on the top of the nest house in the cage, looking right at Duke with anything but friendly attitude. His little feet gripped the boards tensely, his tail circled over his back, and he made small nervous steps constantly as if practicing his getaway. "Take it easy," Duke went on. "No one is going to hurt you or take anything from you. If you were as smart as you think you are, You would know that. A fellow doesn't know very much as long as he thinks the world is all against him, because it isn't true. But don't you understand? We can't be kind to you unless you will let us. You don't take in the goodness that is all around you. You're fighting with all your own funny ideas all the time. You cause the very things you're afraid of. Come on now. Relax. The rest of us are not as bad as you think we are. Give us a chance to be nice to you. Here's a peanut, just to prove I mean it. Meeny advanced one nervous quick step after another towards the peanut. You would have thought he was snatching it from the very gates of Hades. When his nose touched it, he grabbed it with all the bad manners he could muster and raced to a far corner of the cage where he indulged in a chatter that sounded anything but gratitude or polite conversation. I give up, said Duke. Meeny, you dumb cluck. I guess he'll always be that way. Meeny was a little male, but he had all the vanity that was supposed to belong to the other sex. He primped and posed and fussed at his appearance continually. Don't ever put a mirror in there, warned Duke, for that little guy would starve to death looking at himself. It was Meeny whom we first saw when we approached the cage. He was always in some prominent spot, as if waiting to be discovered and admired. Generally he was primping. He washed his face until Duke was afraid he would wear it out. He combed out his bright red fur and was especially particular about keeping his tail fluffy. Apparently, he approved of the touch of white paint that crowned his shoulders, for he made no effort to scrape it off. Possibly he thought it was the prevailing fashion, to be endured no matter what the discomfort. Miney was not quite such a pet as Eeny, but certainly he was more approachable than Meeny. He enjoyed being petted, but immediately after he would straighten out any misplaced hairs. Mo was exactly the opposite of Meeny. The brown paint on his back became black with his rolling and crawling about. Even in that clean cage, he was able to find enough dirt to smear up his face. Time and again we heard Duke break into a laughter at Mo's appearance. There was always something wrong. A black streak across his mouth, a dirty spot over one eye, his tail with no two hairs in the same direction, his feet coated with dust he found in corners. But his disposition was good, and Duke adored him. If you were a human being, Mo, he said, you would probably be one of those much-loved small-town bums. You would live in a little shack all by yourself and do little jobs around, just earning enough to keep from being hungry. You would smile at everyone and be considered a little queer. Some school kids would shout at you, know you by your first name, and like you. People would say you were shiftless and no good, but they would always agree that you had a heart of gold. You wouldn't take a bath often, your hair would never be combed, your clothes would be ragged and your home disorderly, but because you didn't hate anyone, no one would hate you. A small town wouldn't be complete without at least one adorable bum, and I guess our squirrel town couldn't get along without one either. Mo just blinked and looked up at Duke, smiling. If a squirrel can smile. Duke picked him up and put him in his pocket. Mo settled down contentedly. Duke put him on his shoulder. Mo settled there too. Anywhere was all right. It took too much energy to be fussy. Still, Mo was the carefree, adventurous type. He owned the world and felt that he must see it all. The red paint vanished from his shoulders within a few hours due to his intense activity. The cage was too small for him from the day he was put in it. He explored every corner looking for a way out. He was not friendly like Eeny, but certainly not fearful like Meeny. He would run at Duke as quickly as he would run away from him. He was absolutely disrespectful to the primping Meeny and scolded Mo for his indolence. Still, Mo was like the boy who wanted to put on long pants the moment he is through with the three-cornered kind. who read Wild West novels before he learned to spell, and headed out there as soon as he could walk across the room. He looked like that. Stilmo always gave the impression that he was just on the point of going somewhere. He could not crouch like Meeny, and there was no fear in his attitude. He stood erect, but ready, his ears forward while his eyes searched for something exciting to do. "There's a fellow in my outfit I'm going to call Stilmo," said Duke. "He was just born to be an adventurer, joined our outfit because it is the most, that is, we are the first to land. You never know where he will be or what he will do next, except that it will be okay. He won't let anything bind or restrain him. He's just a little embodied spirit of liberty. Yes, sir, I'm going to call him Stilmo, Lieutenant Stilmo. He'll get a kick out of being named after a squirrel." Duke thought into the distance for a moment and added with a smile and a shake of his head, "The rascal." But that little expression, said of one strong, brave man to another, told of a friendship richly deep and important. The squints were becoming impatient with their cage. They wanted the great big outside world where they could see that they could see through the wires. We hesitated to turn them loose. There were hawks, owls, weasels, and eagles out there, and a nice, tender baby red squirrel would be to them like a taste of candy. But the little fellows wanted none of our coddling. Stilmo had begun chewing furtively but determinedly at the wire. Mo was trying to burrow into the floor. Meeny and Miney were poking their little noses through the wire mesh. Even the complacent little Eeny chattered and reached for liberty. One morning we heard Duke call to us for assistance. He had gone down to the squirrel cage. "Jailbreak!" he cried. "Jailbreak!" Gotta turn the page. We ran down and found Duke high in a cedar tree, reaching out for where Eeny had perched on a limb. "They're all out somewhere," he called down breathlessly. "When I opened the cage to get in, they all ran out. It was a put-up job, a planned jailbreak. They ran in 5 directions. I grabbed at all of them and didn't get one." By this time he had reached Eeny, who docilely permitted herself to be picked up and placed in a pocket. Duke brought her down and put her back in the cage. The others were so active we had no trouble seeing them, but catching them was another matter. Stilmo was climbing a white cedar. High from the ground he looked like a high-powered caterpillar. Meeny was up a white pine, and the way he raced about the branches made us shudder. Mo was poking his head out from under the cage, and of course his face was dirty. Calling him Dirty Snout, Duke picked him up and returned him to the cage. Giny fetched a great outlay of food and placed it in the cage as a reward for coming home. It was mealtime at that, and before long we had recaptured all but Stilmo. He was racing about the foliage in high glee, apparently trying to demonstrate to us that he was a full-grown red squirrel, quite capable of taking care of himself. It was nearly a half-hour later when I succeeded in getting Stilmo to come down to where I was offering him a tempting peanut. No doubt he was hungry after all his exertion, and yet he was cautious. This liberty was grand, and he did not want to lose it. A step at a time, and with many a little excited chirp, he came within my reach. While he was preoccupied with the taste of the peanut, I caught him and held him firmly in my hands. He bit me, but one must be ready to endure this occasionally in handling animals. I carried the objecting red squirrel over to the cage as Duke opened the door. And now came an experience that I cannot ever write without cringing, with a peculiar sensation of pain and coating myself with goose pimples. It isn't the kind of pain that comes of your own hurt, but rather the feeling that results when you think of hurting something or someone else you do not want to harm. Stilmo put up new and more successful struggles when he saw the cage open. That jail was out as far as he was concerned. He struggled, bit, scratched, squealed his indignation, and finally succeeded in filtering through my fingers. He fell to the ground, landing right beside the cage. I grabbed wildly, and oh, I wish I hadn't. I caught hold of the very end of his tail just as he was darting under the cage. For an instant, just an instant, I held on. If I had let go, I would have saved myself all this strange pain and those goose pimples that haunted me as I write. Almost immediately, I heard a scolding chatter near my head. There, on the side of a small hemlock tree, was Stilmo, and I still had his tail, or at least half of it, in my hand. A shudder went over me as I realized what had happened. There had been no struggle, no jerk. Apparently, Stilmo had not fastened his clothes on very well that morning, but there was no use dodging the horrible fact I had partially skinned him alive. With a groan, I lifted my unwanted souvenir of skin fur and showed it to Ginny and Duke. They joined me in silent shuddering. The least concerned of all was Stilmo. He paid no attention to his tail, which now consisted of about 2 inches of fur and 4 inches of long, stiff, white, thread-like bone. Obviously, it did not hurt him much. Maybe squirrels and chipmunks are prepared to lose their tails easily. Some nature students think they are, and certainly many of the little creatures are seen with tails abbreviated. It is possible that since this part would be the first reached by pursuing enemies, they have evolved a system of giving up some of it without too severe consequences. I am sure the whole thing hurt us more than it did Stilmo. He went racing away, glad to pay any price for his liberty. Never again did he go into the cage. Within several days, the exposed bony part of his tail had disappeared. I do not know whether he bit it off or it dried up and broke off. Probably he got rid of it himself and forgot the entire matter. I never have forgotten. To this day, when I think of the way he looked on that tree while I knelt there holding the freshly snatched skin in my hand, I suffer and tense up the way some people do when they hear metal scraping on glass. This experience ended the cage stage for our squints. Stilmo was the martyr who had suffered and bled for the liberty of his people. We cut a squirrel-sized hole in the wire at the bottom of the cage so they could go and come as they pleased. Food was kept in the cage for some time, but our tiny pets had little to do with it. Their independent lives had begun. And that's the end of that chapter. Come back tomorrow for chapter 5. We'll see you guys later.